Russia has a list of countries it does not take seriously. Countries that sit inside NATO's borders, collect the alliance's protection guarantee, and contribute just enough to maintain membership without ever building something that could genuinely threaten Moscow's plans. For 30 years, Poland was on that list. Warsaw had the geography, sharing borders with both Russia's Kaliningrad exclave and Russia's ally Belarus. It had the history, a nation that understands what Russian occupation means in ways that most of Europe cannot. It had the motivation. What it did not have, in Russia's calculation, was the capability, the will, or the institutional discipline to translate motivation into genuine military power. That calculation defined Russia's entire Western strategy. It meant Kaliningrad could be used as a forward base for missile strikes against NATO without fear of a credible counter. It meant the Suwalki Gap, the 65-kilometer land corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad that is NATO's single most dangerous geographic vulnerability, could be treated as a potential operational axis rather than a sealed door. It meant Belarus, under Lukashenko's alliance with Moscow, provided a staging ground pointed directly at Warsaw, 200 kilometers to the west. Russia's plan for NATO's eastern flank had Poland in the role of the obstacle, present enough to complicate, but not strong enough to stop. Then, on a night in September 2025, something happened that NATO's Secretary General called the closest the alliance had come to open conflict since the Second World War. 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace. Poland did not file a diplomatic protest. Poland did not call an emergency meeting and wait for consensus. Poland scrambled its F-16s, called in Allied support, activated Article 4 for the first time in alliance history, and with Dutch F-35s and Italian AWACS aircraft coordinating overhead, shot down at least 3 of those drones inside NATO territory. For the first time since the Cold War, alliance aircraft fired at enemy targets above Allied soil. That night was the trigger. But what came after it is the story most people haven't fully grasped, because Poland's response did not stop with the drones. What Poland did next, the military transformation it accelerated, the bilateral commitments it made, and the strategic position it has now built along Russia's most sensitive western flank, represents the most significant shift in European security since Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and Russia has no answer for it. To understand what September 2025 unlocked, you need to understand what Poland had already been building in the years before that night. The story starts in February 2022, the morning Russia invaded Ukraine. While much of Western Europe spent the first weeks of the war debating whether to send helmets, Poland made a decision that would define the next 4 years of its defense policy. Warsaw would not wait for consensus, would not wait for Berlin's approval, would not moderate its response to avoid upsetting Moscow. Poland opened its borders to Ukrainian refugees, ultimately hosting over 3 million people, the largest refugee intake in Europe. It began transferring military equipment to Ukraine within days, including Soviet-era T-72 tanks and artillery systems from its own operational inventory. It lobbied NATO allies relentlessly for deeper military support when others were still calculating diplomatic risk. And simultaneously, quietly, with a focus that the rest of Europe would only notice years later, it began rebuilding its own military from the ground up. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said it plainly in a speech to the Sejm in October 2024. We are building the largest army in NATO Europe, and we are doing it because history has taught us that no one else will protect Poland if Poland does not protect itself. That speech was not rhetoric. It was a budget announcement. Poland's defense spending in 2024 reached 12% of GDP, the highest percentage of any NATO member, higher than the United States, higher than Britain, higher than France. In absolute terms, Poland spent 34 billion euros on defense in 2025. For a country of 38 million people, that number is staggering. It is the kind of commitment that doesn't come from political calculation. It comes from an institutional memory of what happens when you are not ready. The purchases tell the story of what Poland was building toward. Begin with the ground force, because that is where Poland's transformation is most dramatic and most immediately threatening to Russia's operational planning. In July 2022, Poland signed what was at the time the largest arms procurement deal in Polish history, and one of the largest in European history. A contract for 1,000 K2 Black Panther main battle tanks from South Korea to be delivered in waves through 2030, with a significant portion manufactured under license in Poland itself. 1,000 tanks. For context, Germany's entire operational tank fleet at that time was approximately 350 Leopard 2s. The K2 is not a legacy system. It is one of the most advanced main battle tanks in service anywhere in the world. A 120mm smoothbore cannon compatible with NATO standard ammunition. A combat management system that integrates real-time battlefield data from drones and ground sensors. Active protection systems capable of defeating modern anti-tank guided missiles. And a power-to-weight ratio that allows it to operate across the swampy, forested terrain of northeastern Poland, exactly the terrain of the Suwalki Gap, Alongside the K2s, Poland ordered 672 K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzers, again from South Korea, giving its artillery arm both the mass and the mobility to support a high-tempo armored offensive or defensive operation. HIMARS multiple rocket launch systems, 500 launchers on order, a quantity that dwarfs what any other European NATO member has committed to. At 80 kilometers with standard rockets and 300 kilometers with ATAS-MS, Poland's HIMARS fleet gives it the ability to strike targets deep inside Belarus and, critically, throughout the Kaliningrad exclave from positions inside Polish territory. Read that last sentence carefully. From positions inside Poland, using systems Poland already has in inventory, Poland can reach every significant military installation in Kaliningrad. The Iskander missile bases, the air defense sites, the Baltic Fleet facilities at Baltijsk, the airfields that Russia has used for decades as forward strike platforms pointed at Warsaw. Kaliningrad was Russia's dagger pointed at NATO's heart. Poland has turned it into a target. The air component of Poland's transformation adds a layer that Russia's northern air defense planners are only now fully calculating. Poland has operated F-16 Fighting Falcons since 2006, a capable fleet, but aging in configuration and limited in the missions it could credibly support against modern Russian integrated air defense systems. The procurement pipeline Poland has now activated changes that picture fundamentally. 32 F-35A Lightning II stealth multi-role fighters. Contracts signed in 2020, deliveries accelerating through 2025 and 2026, with full squadron operational readiness expected in 2027. The F-35A in Polish service will carry the same JASSM-ER extended-range cruise missile that Finland's fleet carries. 980-kilometer range, low observable, terrain following, bunker penetrating. From Polish airspace, a JASSM-ER can reach Moscow. In addition to the F-35s, Poland procured 48 Fa-50 light combat aircraft from South Korea. Fast, agile, cost-effective platforms for air superiority and close air support, freeing the F-35s for the deep strike and suppression of enemy air defense missions they are designed for. And the air defense architecture behind these offensive platforms is being rebuilt in parallel. Poland operates Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries, the most advanced variant of the Patriot system, capable of intercepting ballistic missiles and advanced cruise missiles. Additional batteries were delivered following the September 2025 drone incident. The Narao short-range air defense system, using CAM missiles developed jointly with the United Kingdom, provides the lower tier. And Poland has entered negotiations for the integration of the Iron Dome system for point defense of critical infrastructure. The picture that emerges is not a country building an army for show. It is a country building a war machine for use. Now we need to talk about the ground Russia cares about most in Poland's context. The Suwalki Gap. This is a 65-kilometer stretch of land along Poland's northeastern border, running between the corner of Belarus to the east and the Kaliningrad exclave to the west. It is the only land connection between the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the rest of NATO. If Russia and Belarus were to simultaneously move forces into this corridor, NATO's Baltic members would be cut off from the alliance by land. Reinforcement would require either air or sea routes, both of which could be contested. NATO military planners have called the Suwalki Gap the alliance's most dangerous terrain for 2 decades. Multiple war games conducted by the RAND Corporation between 2015 and 2020 concluded that Russia could seize the Baltics and close the Suwalki Gap within 36 to 60 hours, faster than NATO could mount a conventional defense response. Those war games assumed a Poland that was not yet the military power it is becoming. They assumed a Poland without 1,000 K2 tanks, without 500 HIMARS launchers, without F-35s carrying JASSM-ERs, without a 300,000-strong standing army, Poland's current target, which would make it the largest active-duty ground force in NATO Europe, backed by a reserve trained for exactly this terrain. Poland's East Shield program, launched in 2023 and now receiving 10 billion euros in funding through 2028, is physically sealing the Suwalki Gap with a combination of anti-tank ditches, fortified positions, sensor networks, underground logistics nodes, and pre-positioned ammunition and fuel depots that can sustain extended combat operations without surface resupply. The Suwalki Gap is being transformed from NATO's most vulnerable point into a fortified killing ground designed to stop Russian armor before it reaches the corridor's center. And the strategic logic of this fortification extends beyond defense. If the Suwalki Gap is sealed and defended credibly, Kaliningrad transitions from a forward base into an isolated enclave. An exclave of Russian territory surrounded on all sides by NATO members. Poland to the south and west, Lithuania to the north and east, with no land connection to Russia and its lines of communication controllable by alliance forces. Russia has approximately 15,000 troops in Kaliningrad, Iskander ballistic missile battalions, S-400 air defense systems, Baltic Fleet facilities, the full spectrum of regional power projection capability, all of it dependent on sea access through a Baltic that is now ringed by NATO territory, and on air corridors that Poland's F-35s and Patriot batteries have made increasingly contested. Poland isn't just defending itself. It is slowly, methodically, with deliberate patience, converting Russia's greatest defensive asset in the West into Russia's greatest strategic liability. Here's where the story requires you to know something about Poland that most international coverage consistently misses. Poland is the only country in NATO that has fought on the same soil twice against Russia, or its Soviet successor, and lost both times at catastrophic cost. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded from the west on September 1st. 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, honoring the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was divided between two totalitarian powers. 6 million Polish citizens died over the next 6 years, nearly 17% of the entire pre-war population, the highest proportional casualty rate of any nation in the Second World War. At the war's end, Poland was liberated, but by the Soviet army, which meant it was not liberated at all. Soviet-backed communists took power, the country's borders were redrawn, Polish officers who had fought with the Western Allies were imprisoned or executed. The people who had lost the most in the fight against Nazi Germany found themselves living under a different kind of occupation. This history is not ancient to Poland. It is living memory. It sits in family kitchens and school curricula and the institutional DNA of the Polish defense establishment in a way that has no direct equivalent in Western Europe. When a German politician debates whether sending tanks to Ukraine might provoke Russia, Poland hears an argument it has heard before. When France calls for negotiation and compromise, Poland remembers what those negotiations produced at Tehran and Yalta. When anyone anywhere suggests that a strong defensive posture near Russia's border might be unnecessarily provocative, Poland's answer is the same one it has always had. We know what happens when we are not strong enough. That is not political rhetoric. It is institutional knowledge, purchased at a price no country should ever have to pay, and it is driving every defense procurement decision, every NATO lobbying effort, and every bilateral security commitment that Poland is making right now. The bilateral security commitment to Ukraine deserves its own examination, because it is the dimension of Poland's current strategy that most directly threatens Russia's operational planning. In January 2024, Poland and Ukraine signed a bilateral security agreement, one of the first in a series of such agreements Ukraine concluded with NATO members after the G7 commitment framework established in Vilnius. The Polish-Ukrainian agreement went further than most. It committed Poland to long-term military support, equipment transfers, training, intelligence sharing, and joint exercises on a defined, funded contractual basis, rather than the discretionary, politically contingent commitments that had characterized Western support to that point. It established a framework for Polish military advisors to operate inside Ukrainian territory in advisory and training roles, and it included language on air defense cooperation that gave Poland explicit interest in the security of Ukrainian airspace along their shared border. This last element matters enormously for Russia's targeting calculus. When Russia plans strikes against Western Ukraine, the Lviv corridor, the border crossing infrastructure, the logistics hubs that feed NATO supplies to the front, it now has to calculate that those targets are not just Ukrainian assets. They are infrastructure that Poland has a bilateral security interest in defending, staffed partly by Polish personnel, connected to Polish logistics chains, and protected by air defense systems that Poland is actively co-funding and cooperating. An attack on Western Ukrainian logistics is, under the terms of the bilateral agreement, at minimum an attack on Polish national interests. Russia's targeting planners have to add that variable to every Western Ukraine strike decision. Every strike that damages infrastructure Poland has formally committed to protecting is a strike that creates a new diplomatic and potentially military obligation for Warsaw. And Poland, as September 2025 demonstrated, does not limit its responses to diplomatic protests. This is the moment that demands the counter-argument, because honest analysis requires it. Russia's position has internal logic, even if that logic is increasingly difficult to execute. First, Poland has not yet completed its military transformation. The K2 tank deliveries are ongoing. Roughly 180 have been delivered as of early 2026, against an order of 1,000. The F-35s are in partial squadron strength. The East Shield fortifications are funded and designed, but not yet built. Poland's military ambition is genuinely formidable, but much of it exists on paper and in production schedules rather than in deployed capability today. Second, Poland's aggressive posture creates its own risks. Every Polish HIMARS launcher that can reach Kaliningrad is a launcher that Russia's military planners must now account for in their targeting lists. Every F-35 that can carry a JASSM-ER toward Russian territory creates a Russian planning imperative to neutralize that capability preemptively in a crisis. Poland's strength is not cost-free. It invites a level of Russian counter-targeting attention that smaller, quieter NATO members don't face. Third, the domestic political dimension in Poland is not uniform. The coalition government under Tusk has maintained the defense buildup, but Polish politics are contested. Future governments could choose different prioritization. Long-term procurement commitments can be renegotiated. The institutional commitment to 4% defense spending is not constitutionally protected. These are real qualifications. They deserve acknowledgement. But consider what they require you to believe in order to change the strategic conclusion. You would need to believe that Poland fails to take delivery of the equipment it has already contracted and partially received. You would need to believe that a country whose institutional memory includes 2 Russian occupations within living memory decides it has been building its army too aggressively. You would need to believe that Poland's bilateral commitment to Ukraine, publicly signed, funded, and operationally active, quietly disappears. None of those things are happening. The trajectory is set, and Russia's planners know it. The financial architecture that Russia's generals are actually looking at when they map Poland's capability in 2028, 2030, and beyond is not comforting for Moscow. Defense budget, 34 billion euros in 2025, with commitments to maintain above 4% of GDP through at least 2030. On current GDP growth projections, that means Poland's defense budget will exceed 40 billion euros annually by 2029. Ground forces, 300,000 active duty target by 2028, backed by a reserve mobilization structure being rebuilt on Finnish lines. Geographic unit assignment, regular training cycles, equipment prepositioning. Poland's army, when fully built out, will outnumber Germany's active force by a factor of 4. Armor. The K2 deliveries reach approximately 500 tanks by 2027 and 800 by 2029. Combined with Poland's existing Leopard 2 fleet of roughly 250 tanks, Poland will operate the largest tank fleet in NATO Europe by 2028. The only NATO members with comparable armor concentrations will be the United States and Turkey. Artillery. The K9 Thunder deliveries give Poland a self-propelled artillery fleet that exceeds the combined inventory of France, Germany, and Italy. 672 systems, all modern, all compatible with NATO ammunition supply chains. Long-range strike, 500 HIMARS launchers. Read that number again. No other NATO member outside the United States operates HIMARS in quantity. Poland is building a precision deep strike capability that turns every location in Belarus and every location in Kaliningrad into a potential target from day one of any conflict. Air power, full F-35 squadron operational by 2027, with JASSM-ER integration adding strategic strike reach. FA-50 fleet providing mass for air superiority and close support, total combat aircraft inventory approaching 200 by 2028. Logistics and infrastructure. The East Shield program creates the hardened, prepositioned logistics base that allows Poland to sustain high-intensity combat operations for months without significant resupply from deeper in NATO territory. This was the vulnerability that NATO's eastern flank always carried, that a fast Russian advance could outrun the alliance's reinforcement timeline. Poland is eliminating that vulnerability by making its own territory the forward logistics base. What Russia is looking at, projected forward 4 years, is a Poland that can independently, without any additional NATO reinforcement, mount a conventional defense against an armored assault from Belarus, and simultaneously place sustained precision fires on every military installation in Kaliningrad. That is not a country that can be dismissed as an obstacle. That is a country that has to be deterred. Here is the historical parallel that makes this moment land with its full weight. In August 1939, Germany's military planners briefed Hitler on the case for war with Poland. Their assessment was direct. Poland's army was large but poorly equipped. Its air force was obsolete, its logistics were inadequate for modern combined arms warfare, and most importantly, its Western allies, France and Britain, had shown in the Czechoslovakia crisis a year earlier that their commitments were not backed by military willingness to fight. The assessment was accurate in every particular except one. It was accurate at that moment. It did not account for what Poland would become if it had the time, the resources, and the political will to transform. Poland did not have that time in 1939. Germany moved before the transformation could happen. Russia is watching Poland transform in real time, and unlike Germany in 1939, does not have the option of moving before the transformation completes. Because Poland is inside NATO, and moving against Poland is Article 5. The historical trap is perfect. Moscow must watch the country it dismissed for 30 years build exactly the military capability Moscow's Western strategy depended on Poland not having, and it cannot act to stop it without triggering the collective defense guarantee that makes action self-defeating. Every month, Russia waits. Poland grows stronger. Every defense ruble Russia spends on Kaliningrad reinforcement is a ruble not reaching Ukraine. Every planning cycle Russia dedicates to the Polish threat is a cycle not refining the Donetsk offensive. Poland 1939 was the version of the country that history consumed. Poland 2026 is the version of the country that history built from the wreckage of those two occupations. And it is the most formidable conventional military power on Russia's western frontier. Russia's generals know this. Some of them have been saying it in internal assessments for 2 years. The political leadership has not yet found a way to respond that doesn't make the situation worse. The September 2025 drone incident is the moment this transformation became visible to the world in real time, and the operational details of what happened that night deserve close examination. On the evening of September 14th, 2025, Russian long-range UAVs operating in a saturation wave against northwestern Ukraine began deviating from their intended flight paths. 19 drones entered Polish airspace in a window of approximately 40 minutes, tracked continuously by Polish air defense radars from the moment they crossed the border. Poland's response was immediate and coordinated in a way that reflected years of preparation for exactly this contingency. Polish F-16 interceptors were airborne within 6 minutes of the first border crossing. The duty officer at NATO's Combined Air Operations Center in Uedom, Germany, initiated alliance air coordination within 8 minutes. Dutch F-35s, operating under a NATO air policing rotation in the region, were vectored to support. Italian AWACS aircraft provided the airspace management picture that allowed multiple national aircraft to operate in the same contested airspace without conflicting. The legal authorization framework Poland had prepared in advance was activated. Polish law, amended specifically in anticipation of this scenario, permitted the engagement of unidentified airborne objects violating sovereign airspace when they posed a threat to persons or critical infrastructure on the ground. 3 drones were intercepted and destroyed above Polish territory. The other 16 exited Polish airspace, or were tracked until they went inactive over Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Tusk addressed the same the following morning. His statement was 9 words that NATO had never heard from a member government in the context of this war. We protected our airspace. We will do it again. Article 4 was activated the same day. The consultations it triggered produced, within 2 weeks, the deployment of additional Patriot batteries to Poland's eastern border, the establishment of a permanent enhanced air policing rotation with increased Allied aircraft, and the formalization of engagement protocols that allowed Polish and Allied aircraft to fire on airborne threats inside NATO territory without requiring real-time political authorization. That last point is the one Russia's military planners found most alarming. Pre-authorized engagement, standing rules permitting Allied aircraft to fire without waiting for a political decision at the time of the incident. The bureaucratic delay that Russia had implicitly been counting on, the time it would take for NATO governments to consult, authorize, and respond, had been effectively eliminated for the air threat scenario. The wall Russia had been testing for years with drone incursions and airspace violations had been replaced with a loaded gun pointing back. What Russia is now facing on its western flank is not the Poland it modeled its strategy around. It is facing a country whose defense budget will exceed Russia's European military spending in specific capability categories within 3 years. A country whose tank fleet will be the largest in NATO Europe within 4 years. A country that has turned the Suwalki Gap from a vulnerability into a kill zone. A country that has formalized its military commitment to Ukraine and placed Polish institutional interest directly in the path of Russian strikes on Western Ukrainian logistics. And behind all of this military capability sits the thing that no procurement contract can replicate and no defense budget can purchase: will. Poland's will to defend itself is not a policy position that changes with elections. It is not a strategic posture adopted because NATO required it. It is the product of what every Polish family carries, the knowledge of what happened when Poland was not strong enough, the specific weight of 6 million dead, the memory of promises made at Allied conferences that were not kept, the understanding that geography placed Poland between 2 empires that have historically treated it as a corridor or a prize. Russia spent 30 years dismissing Poland as an obstacle. It bet that history was behind it, that the post-Cold War security architecture was settled, that the country whose generals it had once invited to Warsaw Pact briefings would remain a manageable presence on its western flank. That bet is now costing Russia its entire western strategy. The Suwalki Gap is closing. Kaliningrad is being encircled in slow motion by capability, by economics, and by the inexorable logic of an alliance that is growing stronger every month, while Russia's resources are consumed by a war it did not expect to last this long. Putin crossed the last red line when he launched that drone wave over Poland. Poland's response was not to protest. It was to demonstrate, in the clearest possible operational language, that the days of free violations were finished. And then Poland went back to work, building the army that will ensure that every calculation Russia ever made about its western flank has to be redone from the beginning. Russia underestimated Poland in 1939. It underestimated Ukraine in 2022. History suggests these two facts are connected by the same error. The assumption that a country fighting on its own soil for its own survival, with living memory of what losing means, can be overwhelmed by mass, speed, and firepower before it finds a way to make the fight too expensive to continue. Poland is not waiting to find out if that assumption will be tested again. It is making absolutely certain the test never comes. Subscribe to the channel. And in our next analysis, we examine the piece of this picture that nobody is talking about. The bilateral Poland-Lithuania military corridor that is quietly changing the operational geometry of the Suwalki Gap in ways that could permanently alter Russia's ability to threaten the Baltic states. You will not want to miss it.